Hi, I'm Mark Rothermick with Genesis Ag, and I'm here today in a cornfield in eastern Nebraska. I want to spend a little bit of time and try to get a little video to show you a little bit of what I do, what I call my late season ear analysis. So we're going to walk through a few different steps, some of the things that I like to do, and some of these things are very quick and easy to do. It just takes a couple of minutes to jump out of the combine or the grain cart and do a few counts. There are a few other things that we'll spend a little more time digging into, but just kind of want to take some time and give you a little bit of insight into some of the things that I like to look at. The first and the easiest, quickest count you can do is just an ear count to see what your final ear production per acre is. It's very similar to doing a population stand count in the spring. You just measure out 1,000th of an acre, whether that be 17 feet 5 inches for your 30-inch rows or whatever that might be if you're on a different row spacing. Count that distance and see how many ears you actually produced. For this type of count, any stalk that puts an ear on, I count because I figure it did what it could to produce. So that's how the first thing to do, so that when you do the rest of your calculations, you know how many ears you can count on to carry you through to the end of the season. The next thing we're going to talk about is how many deficient ears that you might have in your population as you go through the field. For this, you simply walk down the row, count 100 ears or stalks, and keep track of how many deficient ears you have. Oftentimes I'm asked, what do I consider deficient ear when we're doing this type of a stalk count? So I'm going to turn the camera around and give you a few shots of what I would look at for that type of a... So you can see here, this particular stalk, you can see it's a very small stalk compared to everything else around it. You look at the ear, it's obviously nothing up to par for what we would expect to see. And when we strip it back, you can see it's just kind of a nubbin type ear. So I would definitely count something like that. If we move down here just a little bit, here's another one. You can see it actually is a corn plant. It's about the right spacing, but it's a very spindly stalk. I would actually count this as a blank. And I would keep track of those as well if you've got those. As we move down through the rest of it, obviously we're just counting ears to see what we've got. So, pretty consistent. As we come down through the field here, these are all very consistent ears, pretty well spaced, pretty good height. Here we come upon another one. The stalk doesn't look a whole lot off of the normal. The ear, if we peel it back, certainly not a bad ear, but depending on what your goal is and how intensive you want to be in your counts, some people might consider that a deficient ear when compared to its neighbor up here that's obviously somewhat bigger. Some other observations as we move down through the rows here, when you can notice that all of the ear placement is very consistent with this hybrid in this field. I'm holding the camera at about the height of my head. You can see that just about every ear is pretty consistently close to that height. All the way down through here. That's a great sign. That shows us a lot of consistency. There's another kind of smaller ear that I would probably count as deficient in a lot of instances. But right next to him is another good healthy ear. When we start finding these deficient plants, we start to look at what could possibly have impacted that. We can come down and we can look at the root system, look at the root structure. This stalk doesn't look terribly off. It's certainly not a complete dud, but it's not quite up to par with everything else that's around it. So making those assessments as to what caused that plant to slow down, to back off, whether it was just a seed that was weak, never had the vigor to really get going, whether there was some impact within the season between planting and ear determination. You know, you can look, he didn't do too bad. He did try to set quite a few rows around. He just looks like he ran out of steam partway through the season and decided that he just couldn't do any more than that ear. In general, looking at the rest of these stalks though, you can see we've got still pretty good stay green in this at this point in the season. We did check this hybrid this morning and it's running about 24% at the moment. If we strip a couple of ears back, we can start to assess some of the other things we have. Obviously, this one's going to have really good kernel set on it. And looking at the stalks up and down, you can see we've still got good green color in the stalks, working our way down. So these stalks are good and healthy as we move into the dry down stage of this corn plant. So standability in this should be very good, but we should also have good kernel weight in a hybrid like this that continued to pump nutrients into that ear as long as it possibly could. So those are some things that we start to look for as we move into these types of assessments. So now I've taken time to go ahead and strip a few of these ears back so that we could look at them a little closer. When we start looking at these down through the rows, you can see again the consistency we have from side to side. Ear placement is very consistent. Size is very consistent all the way down through here. When I did some counts on these, a lot of these are running 18 and 20 rows around. Most of them are 36 to 42 long. So there are two components that comprise the yield that you really need to focus on. But there are three measurements that I use to determine that. Those two factors, the most important factors, are the number of kernels you produce and what each kernel weighs. And that's getting about as basic as you can. So when I start to assess these, what I would do would be to pull about a dozen of these ears, and I usually go for the better looking ears, the top end, so that we can get an idea what our top end production would be if every ear was just like the best ones that we see here. So at that point, I would pull those and take them out, and I'll talk to you a little bit more later in another video about how I do that part of the process. But just doing a quick assessment in the field even, you can look at how many rows you have around and what kind of length you have to get your kernel count for each ear. Obviously with these we're going to be running anywhere from 700 up toward 800 kernels per ear. That's a really good count. But the other factor we have to look at is how much does each kernel weigh? And that's not always necessarily greatly correlated with test weight. While there is a correlation, a lot of my testing I've found kernel weights can vary quite a bit, which would be a factor in how many kernels it takes to make a bushel of corn, even though the test weight may not move as much as you would think. So we would take a dozen of these ears, we would take them out, we'd take them to a place where we could get around them and actually lay them out, count the kernels on each ear, and then shell those kernels, shell each ear off, and get the actual weight of the grain that's on each one of these ears. By doing that, we can start to look at what kind of a season did my crop have. When I say that, we can look at how many rows around do we have. That's an indication of our early season growth, V3 to V6 time frame. When you start looking at the length, then you start to determine later in the season what kind of growing conditions did this crop have. The fact that a lot of these plants and ears don't have a whole lot of tip back is indicative that we had pretty good conditions toward the end of that part of the life, and the plants were feeling pretty good. So the next factor then we have to look at would be what is the kernel weight in here. I would venture to guess that just from feeling these ears, this is going to be a pretty good field of corn. And I think the producer's pretty excited to get into this with the combine and see what it is. But we did pull a few of these ears earlier this morning. When I get a chance to process those, I'll try to videotape that so that we can do a continuation of how this process would go and what this field actually turned out to be. So one of the other things I've been asked is, what other things do I look for when I'm doing ear assessments? I've got a couple of ears here I wanted to show you. When you look at this particular ear, you can see right here there's a little bit of a hiccup in its kernel formation. If we come across the row, here's another one that's showing a little bit of the same thing. Now, not every ear has that in this particular field, so I'm probably not too overly concerned about it. But if you start to see that at a consistent space, one thing I will say is on these two ears, it's about the same location as far as from top to bottom of the ear. If I were to see a significant amount of that in a particular field, then I'd want to go back and start looking at what was going on in this plant's life, probably somewhere in that V4 to V5 time frame is when it would have been determining the rows around at this stage of the ear. Again, if you start seeing a significant number of plants that have this kind of a formation anywhere up and down the ear, then I would suggest we go back and start looking at what weather conditions we had, or maybe even an application that we might have made of some sort of a product that might have impacted that plant and how it was feeling at that stage of its growth.